Hello, everyone. Let's get started. On behalf of the WEFI organizers, I would like to welcome everyone to join the first WEFI lecture. I'm Song from Yale, and our organizers are David Robinson from Duke, Yael Hochberg from Rice, and as well as our speaker today, Mike Ewens. WEFI Lecture invites leading researchers in topics in entrepreneurial finance and innovation to provide an overview of important and emerging topics in the field. And the hope is to encourage more high quality research as well as the sharing of knowledge. This year, we have a lineup of 9 speakers and 1 panel discussion. You actually can take a look at our website to check all those speakers, the dates, as well as recommended reading materials. And we very much look forward to your active participation over the year. Today, we're very lucky to have our first WEFI lecture speaker, Mike. Mike is a professor of finance and entrepreneurship from Caltech, so he's very used to dealing with the smartest people in the world. Mike's research covers several very important topics in entrepreneurial finance, from VC contracting, security design, to corporate governance in VC, and so on. But one frontier that Mike has been pushing with different groups of co-authors is the topic of gender, race, and entrepreneurship, which is also the theme for today. Those work include his 2014 article, Statistical Discrimination or Prejudice, a large sample field experiment, and his more recent work with Rick Townsend on our early stage investors biased against women. So today, Mike is going to give us his thoughts on this incredibly important topic. And Mike, take it away. And you will also announce the ground rules, I hope.
Yes, I will. Thanks, Song. Thanks for the intro. Let me get started. Welcome, everyone. Let's fingers crossed we do not have a Zoom outage, but I am recording this. So can you guys see the screen okay? Is it moving? Song, moving?
It's not moving.
This happened before. Hold on, I think I know why. The rule is you go to slide. Now is it moving?
Yes, it's moving.
Okay, so lesson is make it slideshow first. Okay, ground rules. Feel free to interrupt with clarifying questions. As you'll see, I have too much material. I'm going to go as 75 minutes, very likely. But if you have a deeper question about a specific slide or the field in general, don't hesitate to stay on after I'm done talking. We'll have a sort of open mic Q&A. I'll be around, and feel free to email me as well. And then I think the other ground rule is if you have any questions about you want to see the slides in detail in the video, we'll post that probably the next few days on the website, which I'll have a link to soon. So all the papers I talk about will be there along with the slides. Okay, let's get started. So big outline for today is I want to talk about some goals for today's talk, what you hopefully will get out of all the time you're going to spend here. I want to define some terms, one in particular. I want to talk about the big questions in the economics of discrimination. So finance, as mainly a finance researcher, but coming out of econ, I've seen sort of both worlds, and as usual, finance is following what econ's done. And I think we can learn a lot about this field from how the economists do it. Then I'm going to talk about the facts and quotes, which are, a selected set of things I think matter for this area. I'm going to overview the theory, and as you'll see, I will not do justice to it. There will not be enough math, for example, and it'll be about 5 or 6 slides, but understanding this, setting it out is important. And then I'll talk about methods to explore discrimination and propose some next steps. So to keep myself accountable, I've kind of talked about the first set of bullets already, but by the end of the lecture, I hope either or both, you'll be better equipped to read work in the area, sort of, hey, I want to start working in this area. What should I read? What might be important? I think I've picked some good papers to start. I have inevitably missed some important work. And if you're in the room, I apologize. It's not a judgment. It's just a space constraint plus what I already knew. And then the other would be, of course, better equipped to produce work in the area. I think this is a slightly more important goal because I assume many of you are here because you know the work in the area. I'm going to view this as a sort of how do we get published in a top 3 journal, or how do we get published in a top econ journal, more difficult, of course. But think about the benchmarks and bars there. And as I mentioned, there's a website, there it is, for details on the content here. Let me move that a little, there you go. Okay. So let's define some terms. The first one's obviously quite important. What do I mean by discrimination? Let me quote a couple of authors that will show up many times today from a survey paper on field experiments, Marion Bertrand and Duflo, they talk about discrimination using correspondence studies, and they have a nice, quick definition of it. Members of a minority group, and there's a list of them, are treated differentially, i.e. less favorably than members of a majority group with otherwise identical characteristics and in similar circumstances. So we can formalize this, quote unquote, using a nice paper from Kane 86, where they were thinking, particularly in labor setting, things like wages or hiring decisions, so let that be Y. Consider a simple regression of Y on productivity controls like education and ability if we have them. And importantly, we're going to assume those are exogenous. And then we're going to have a dummy Z that's a dummy variable for whether you're in the minority group or whether you're an out group, generally from the decision maker for the dependent variable. Now, given the assumption about the exogeneity of controls, then discrimination in a very simple way from a regression perspective is an estimate alpha hats less than 0. Now, of course, what we mean by discrimination is defined above, but as we'll see, discrimination takes many forms. And of course, in turn, results in different policy implications. But this is also interpreted as differential treatment. And I'll use that language a little bit more because I'm always cautious about using, for example, the word effect. The same thing goes here. Using even the word discrimination assumes you've tested for the alternative theory. So you may hear me use differential treatment on and off. The other piece to keep in mind is I'm going to focus particularly early on what was called by, from a nice survey paper, current discrimination. What this means is we're going to take as given a set of predetermined characteristics. So this might be education, wealth levels, and the like. And this is opposed to taking the effects of prior discrimination on those characteristics. So a good example of this is we'll see is that African Americans, for example, have been discriminated against for decades in the United States in particular. This leads to differences in human capital allocation. Okay. There we are. Okay, so that's the definition and as formal as it's going to get. Let's talk about some of the questions and motivating facts, both from econ and finance. Let me start out with, I've presented a couple of discrimination papers across departments, and it's actually surprising. I actually have to defend why one might study discrimination. So this is my slide at doing that. I don't think it's something that demands a lot of defense, but let's at least start somewhere. So from the AEA lecture, Marion Bertrand has a great paper. I'd recommend if there's one paper to read, this is the one as a starting point. It's called Gender in the 21st Century. And she talks about why one would want to study discrimination. And we can replace gender with race, but I'll just read it as gender. So there's a fairness and justice argument that tells us women should share the same set of opportunities as men. There's also an efficiency argument. Models show that greater gender equality in labor market access can improve economic growth. All these models share the premise, correct premise, that men and women share at birth similar distributions of labor market relevant talent. Starting from, from that premise, it is obvious that any barrier to women's entry into the labor market or into some specific occupations will be distortive to economic outcomes. So the key idea here is that whether you think you have a fairness or justice benchmark, or you have an efficiency argument, which I think most people trained as economists have at least that efficiency side, discrimination and the resulting inequality that it generates is an important area to study. And we can see this, in some data from Aki et al. They have some work using census data where they can compare the income distribution to the share of the population. And the takeaway from this figure, the vertical line 1 would, if your dot was there, it would tell you that by race, you have the same percentage, you're in the same percentile of the income distribution as your share of the population. And the takeaway here is that whites have a higher percentage essentially of the total income relative to their population share compared to Hispanics, African Americans, and other minorities. And so this is one potential consequence of discrimination, is the fact that these individuals have a result in both wealth and income inequality. Now, not only do we, from a fairness argument or efficiency argument, is this an important area to study? The other reason is there's simply more research to be done, which is both good and bad, right? It's good for researchers like us in the room. It's bad, of course, because this is the kind of problem we'd like to solve, and it would be nice if we had all the answers. So a large literature, and there's some summary papers, again, a pretty long list, documents pervasive differential treatment by race and gender. This pervasive differential treatment has declined over time. That's an important fact, particularly by gender, but gaps still remain, or these gaps have diminished, but the precursors are different. So we're going to talk about entrepreneurship today, and we'll see that both of these still hold. We could see the second point over on the right side of the slide, where from this 2020 lecture, she talks about STEM choices. So this is basically educational choices, and you can see across the world, each bullet is a country. The men are much more likely to select into STEM degrees, both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees, which is a potential problem. Even though we may have diminished the labor market, say earnings gap, for example, is smaller, there's still education choices going on. And on the other side, there's a research gap. As you can, a recent story in the Washington Post that highlights the Atlanta Feds wrote an essay about the role the Fed has in dealing with racial inequality. There's a nice quote here, but earlier this month in August, congressional Democrats introduced new legislation to potentially change the Fed's mission. And when I got out of this, reading this, along with learning something about how the Fed's mission could change, was that policymakers and practitioners believe that one reason the Fed should do this is simply they have an army of researchers, and having attention of those researchers to these topics can both expose more answers, but also generate more data. And so basically, this is an important area, both because we have gaps in our knowledge, and even though there are some improvements, there are still issues to resolve. Now, why entrepreneurship and discrimination? Well, I think that the main reason is, even though in labor markets and education situations, the gap has shrunk both in race and gender. So economists essentially seen some of the problems being solved, quote unquote. This is not the case in entrepreneurship, both high growth and small business. So the gap is persisting across almost every stage of the entrepreneurship space. So firm formation, capital raising, and the like. And here are some screenshots of a few of many figures demonstrating this from Gompers and Wang, diversity and innovation. And what you can see basically relative to benchmarks, either in the population as a whole, there are fewer minorities as VCs and investment professionals. And in this figure on the right, as opposed to consulting, investment banking, and the labor force overall, the gap is small relative to 50%. We don't see that in entrepreneurship and venture capital more generally. And so the gap persists. And an interesting question is, what's going on here? What is unique, if anything, about the entrepreneurial process that would drive these gaps essentially? So my view of what's going on is summarized by a bunch of screenshots of published papers in the area, which is simplified as: founding a company is complex. So consider all of the places in all these papers I've highlighted here where gender and race could matter. Simply, the story here for me is that the entrepreneurial setting is a set of impediments to a complicated decision. It's from founding, firm formation, growth, exit, among many other things. And insofar as race and gender historically have mattered outside of in less complex settings, those reasons suggest that that's going to just add to the impediments that we see in entrepreneurship. So as an example, liquidity constraints and financing constraints are a huge problem in entrepreneurship. And going back to my slide on inequality, we know that there's already disparities in wealth and in income by race. So it's only going to exacerbate the problems when we enter a world of additional constraints. And so, that's basically my story is entrepreneurship. One reason the gap is bigger here and hasn't gone away is probably this complicated setting. And so the pipeline here is what's going on. We have an education and human capital decision that generates impediments, family labor and household labor, financing constraints, the role of intermediaries. So we not only have individuals making decisions, but we have intermediaries in the marketplace can have their own impediments. And then there's the geographic concentration of resources. So I don't think anyone's really talking about this, but I think the main problem we have for a puzzle like this is really the complexity of the area we're studying. Fortunately, any of the answers that we can provide on the role of race and gender in entrepreneurship can guide policy. And this is particularly important in entrepreneurship because many of us try to answer these questions because we think we might be able to, help policymakers improve access to entrepreneurship, for example, and help entrepreneurial firms grow. And, one example might be we're going to encourage countries to generate their own Silicon Valley. Well, that seems like a nice strategy, but if a precursor problem is race and gender problems are driving entrepreneurial decision making, well then starting a Silicon Valley 2 in Nebraska, for example, isn't really going to help things until we can get to the precursor problems. And so guiding policy, once we solve or understand these race and gender problems, is quite important. Okay, so let's go through some facts. I've already hinted at a few from the Gompers and Wang paper, but I want to talk about differences in founding, financing, growth, and exits. Before I begin, I already hinted at this. There are some signs of hope. This is probably the only positive slide in the whole set of lecture slides, is the labor market, where much of the attention of the economists in this area was for decades, has improved. And in fact, if you look at resume studies, like sending out fake resumes and checking whether potential employers discriminate or treat women differently, there's evidence that suggests, in fact, that the bias is positive. And so this quote here suggests that. And Will and Ilya have a nice review of correspondence study in their field experiment paper, where they did an enormous amount of work putting all this together. But the main takeaway here from their analysis is that the weighted average bias is actually in favor of women. It's 13%, but statistically insignificant. There are some signs of hope, but from my review of the literature preparing for this slide, this is about all I could find for real hope for a lot of the issues in discrimination and differential treatment. And as usual, I have to be careful when I talk about entrepreneurship, because a lot of the focus, my research included, is on venture capital. And I want to highlight that small business is a bigger player in the space of entrepreneurship and does warrant attention. Unfortunately, data availability, demands for faculty driven by MBA teaching needs, and the hotness of the area, there are a lot of VC papers. The data availability is a real one. We have lots of information on outcomes, financing, investors. This leads to more papers. I want to highlight that even though I may not be talking as much about small business, it is important to note that, for example, 83% of entrepreneurs do not have access to bank loans or venture capital. I also want to highlight these types of firms may endogenously, given discrimination, not be able to access bank and VC, but it's also possible that's not true. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do these types of entrepreneurs who aren't facing, for example, intermediaries, what kind of discrimination do they face given the sort of simpler perspective they have when it comes to financing? I think it's an interesting unanswered question. Okay, so let's talk about some facts. What about women, minorities, and small businesses more generally? Well, nice survey by the Census and NSF. It used to be the annual survey of entrepreneurs, is now the annual business survey, has facts about both female small business ownership and minority ownership. You can see about 20% of small businesses, that's high growth and otherwise, are owned by women, 17% by minorities, and a very small fraction by African Americans. And you can see this in a time series graph over on the right, where we can look at using CPS data, the gap in business ownership by race. And here, the gap has not shrunk when we compare white versus African American. If we think of the benchmark being white, where this is the majority or in-group, almost every minority group outside of Asian has a gap in terms of their percentage of the population. The minorities population that small business is significantly lower. This is a gap that needs to be explained, as you might imagine. Now, conditional on founding, this is sort of the founding decisions overall. What if we condition on founding? There are also differences, particularly on the minority side. So basically, takeaways from these two snapshots of tables is first that African American owned businesses are smaller. They have higher failure rates and lower profitability. And an open question, partially I think answered in this work by Fairley and Robb, is that part of the reason seems to be human capital accumulation. So African American workers that seek out entrepreneurial ventures forming firms are less likely to have experience in family-owned businesses, for example, and that seems to be a leading reason for these differences in size and performance. The Kaufman Firm survey is another piece of evidence that suggests that minority-owned businesses, you can see it down here, are significantly smaller in terms of total assets. And this is a persistent gap in size that, again, is, I think, unexplained and could be driven by discrimination. As I mentioned, I'll talk about VC. Here are some nice pictures from PitchBook. These are global statistics. We'll show some US stuff soon. A big takeaway from these figures is women are underrepresented relative to their proportion of the population, of course, is 50%. They, if I start in the middle here, they found an increasing fraction of firms, venture-backed firms, are founded by at least one female founder. We're up at about 20%. So there's some encouraging news there. But we see two disparities. Even though they found 20% of firms, They do not raise 20% of the capital. It's getting there, but they still have less of the capital than they do of the firms, and they are less likely to have top executive positions like CEO. So again, with this type of data, we have new benchmarks, conditional on founding, what other characteristics or gaps are there. In this case, we have capital and executive level positions. If we condition on the US VC-backed firms, and then we can break down founding teams even further, PitchBook has a nice website. Here's the link where they're sort of in real time tracking this data. We see that female founders only teams, so solo or multiple members, are a very small fraction of VC-backed startups, 6.3%. And again, when we compare capital percentage, we see a similar pattern or gap. That is, the amount of capital raised is significantly lower than the fraction of firms that are founded by female-only teams. Now let's go back one step and think about the founding decision for these startup founders, either high growth or otherwise. And what we see from that, there's some nice work using Massachusetts and California incorporation data that shows, conditioning on VC, basically we get the same results, is that founding firms, high growth or otherwise, is about 20 to 22% of firms. And we see the funnel is not so good when it comes to gender, 22% of women. And when we condition on VC backed, it falls to 10%. Part of the reason may be some of these facts in this Merrick and Yan paper using LinkedIn data. This is a great paper with an enormous data set on employees by industry and founding decisions. And an interesting takeaway from that is if we step back pre-founding decision and we look within industry, an important source of founders are individuals that work within the industry. So for example, VC-backed startups tend to come from tech industry firms, established firms. They're spawning from those firms. And what this data allows the authors to do is get a benchmark, a new benchmark for what we might expect the percentage of founding teams within industry to be women, female founded. And we see is the percentage for tech, for example, is about 35%. Once we condition on that, only about 15% of tech firms are founded by women. So we have a new gap. Basically, these lecture slides often just show gaps and gaps and gaps. And this is a sort of third level gap where conditional on tech employment, we see a gap in founding decisions. And one of their conclusions, to summarize, would be that even though they have a higher fraction of women in this industry than they did 10 years ago, they are not represented at the high levels of those firms, C level and VP level. And that's potentially where many of the founders come from, are high level employees at tech firms and other industries. So let's go now the other direction. Who are the financiers? This is a well-known fact, so I'll go over it pretty quickly, is that most VCs are old white men. In this case, Deloitte and NVC are now running what appears to be a biannual survey of VC firms and asking who the gender and race composition of the workers at those firms. They have all positions. You can see near parity by gender, but once we go to the high level, GP level, VCs, only 14% are women. And it is significantly worse for minority, particularly African-American representation in VC firms. This number is probably so low that if we ever wanted to run a test regression-wise, we'd have very little power to test anything. This is confirmed in some research using VentureSource. 75% of VC firms have never had a senior investment professional who is a woman. So a rough summary, one slide summary of what we know. Minorities are dramatically underrepresented at all stages as entrepreneurs. This is both, if I repeated this LinkedIn sample, I suspect it'd be even worse. There's little presence on the supply side. And as you'll see, most of the research is going to focus on the gender questions. Fortunately, I think what we learned about gender can inform the questions about minority and racial discrimination. But the lack of power, for example, there just aren't enough entrepreneurs who are minorities in venture to really test things, means we're going to focus most of our attention right now, at least, on the gender questions. There is an increasing trend in participation, but it's significantly less still than 50%. And there is a large gap on capital raising and the capital supply more generally. Okay, so let's talk about theory. I'm going to do, as it says here, too short an overview with lots of sites. I'm not going to do justice to pretty much anything, but the goal here is to give an overview and guidance for anyone who's interested in the area. So the framework is going to be fairly simple, although when I started working in this back in grad school a long time ago, this slide or framework was a lot simpler. So the models of discrimination, as many of you probably know, are statistical and taste. And more recently, statistical has been broken down into two types, accurate and inaccurate. If you've heard of things like miscalibrated beliefs or stereotypes, that's basically what's driving this distinction within the statistical discrimination story, which I'll describe soon. There is an excellent review of, it's an older review, but an excellent review of theory, particularly on the statistical side, in this survey paper of the labor literature, both empirical and theory. If you're interested in more formal description of models, I'm not going to go into all of them, but if you are, that's a great site. So let me use as an example two hypothetical, relatively representative, unfortunately, entrepreneurs in venture capital. So John and Sarah, we're going to assume they have similar backgrounds. We're also going to, add a little noise to their characteristics, and we're going to replicate them a couple thousand times for these thought experiments. What they're going to do is they're going to go out and seek capital. Both of them, with their similar backgrounds and ideas, need $1 million of startup capital. And what they're going to do is ask for this capital from a bunch of otherwise identical investors, which I've summarized here in this picture, which we know from the Gompers and Wang is a good representation of the average or typical VC, the white dudes in suits. Sometimes Carol, the VC, will show up with her own capital supply, and Sarah and John may ask her for an investment as well. Okay, so let's start with the sort of most common view of discrimination. When you talk to non-academics and they think about discrimination, they tend to think of taste-based discrimination. What is this? Well, of course, this is when decision makers either have a distaste for outgroup or a prejudice where some member of a majority group has a taste against interacting with a minority group. This is an irrational behavioral story. There's no way to rationalize this behavior. Studying it does not justify it. All those other things have to be put out there. I want to point out that you do not necessarily need majority minority. You may have sort of powerful group versus not powerful group. So if you have a situation, for example, in VC, where women and men in the population are 50-50, men are technically a majority group in the context of that space, simply because they historically are the dominant player, both on the supply side and the demand side. Becker's 57 work is, of course, the main research in this area. It started a whole string of work. If you've heard of things like homophily, to me, this is one and the same with taste-based discrimination. This is a situation where individuals tend to disproportionately associate themselves with others similar to themselves. Now, you can, of course, rationalize almost anything. And if you've ever presented a paper on discrimination in a finance audience, that's often what you have to do. Is an audience wants to rationalize this misbehavior or discrimination. You can do the same with homophily. Lower communication costs and imperfect informations are ways to rationalize this preference for sameness. Doesn't matter, it is still a taste-based story. And at the heart, you may view these similarities as beneficial because of lower communication costs, but they are not inherent. They are just a byproduct of things like norms or stereotypes. Now, agents with these types of preferences, let's call it prejudice, they should be less sensitive to information or signals of quality. The story here is if you are racist, then you are against all minorities regardless of type. You can make it more complicated than that. That's just another version of taste. I'm going to simplify it to this point. And importantly, you're going to pay the cost of this preference in a competitive market. Under some assumptions, competition will remove all of this. One story is if you have perfect entry, then all the non-discriminating firms will hire away all the minorities and you won't have a problem anymore. Of course, we haven't seen most discrimination go away, so it seems like the assumptions of that are probably wrong. You could also view this as biased beliefs about types, which I think, Ramana, that's sort of my answer to your earlier question. We get some pretty straightforward predictions for our Sarah John asking the white dudes for money. They are going to uniformly treat the outgroup worse after controlling for observables, and this translates either into a lower standard for the in-group, or you could read this as a higher standard for, of course, the outgroup. Now, when you do a taste-based discrimination paper, an empirical work on this, the most popular test for taste, as opposed to alternative explanations we'll get to, are outcomes. So think, did Sarah and John go public, or did they raise a follow-on round of financing? And the intuition here is if agents are indeed making choices with non-profit maximizing goals, then within group decisions should underperform. Now, what's important here is recently researchers have revealed that this requires an additional assumption of accurate beliefs, which I'm going to get to soon. This just complicates what was otherwise a simple test of let's look at outcomes and tease out taste versus statistical. That's not enough, unfortunately, anymore. So in this world, of course, Sarah's less likely to receive funding, and conditional on funding, she will outperform John if we have good proxies for that. Again, assuming accurate beliefs. And if we have Carol step in the room and we assume she has similar taste-based preferences or otherwise, then male investors will prefer John, female investors will prefer Sarah, and we'll see similar results. And this is a preview to some of the suggestions I have for the literature is do your best to get information, for example, on outcomes, and variation in decision maker gender will help you tease out stories much more easily. Okay, so taste versus statistical. Let me start with the simpler version of statistical discrimination under accurate beliefs. What's statistical discrimination? In 3 bullet points, it's differential treatment that follows from agents maximizing a purely financial objective function. So they have no inherent preferences for race or gender, but they are in a situation of imperfect information where it's difficult to extract signals. So my view of this is I have to make a decision about hiring, firing, or wages. I have education, I have test scores, for example, but I need more information. And historically, I may correctly know that certain genders underperform the other gender. So I'm going to use the signal gender to improve my forecast of wages to make my hiring decision. Even though I do not have a taste for gender, it helps me make forecasts of type. Now, that assumes correct beliefs, as we'll see. Now, the 2 types with correct beliefs, there's some older sites here, Phelps and Arrow. Outgroups are correctly perceived as having lower productivity. When I did work back in 2012 through 2014, this is the world I was in. I just assumed this, and I probably wouldn't be able to publish the paper as it is without more work, given the complications of stories there. The other story is really a signal versus noise. The precision of signals could lead to differential treatment. Anger and Kane's 77 work have this. You could tell a story about cultural differences. So men don't understand women, for example, between investor and entrepreneur could lead them to punish female entrepreneurs, even though they have no distaste. And this has some interesting long-run consequences on human capital accumulation and equilibrium, and there's some sites there, which I encourage you to read if you're interested in the theory in the long run. Okay. Sorry guys, I just want to, having trouble muting. Okay, make sure you mute it. I can hear people fumbling around. It's a little distracting. Okay, let's see. So what if beliefs are not accurate? That is, if we go back here, the outgroup is actually not known to have lower productivity. So women are no worse at entrepreneurship than men. There's a great pair of papers, Boren et al. I think it's the same set of co-authors. One's in the AR, one is a working paper. This is the inaccurate statistical discrimination. They highlight that the tests of discrimination, I'm going to get to in a second, assume that agents have accurate beliefs. Why would they not have accurate beliefs? Well, the psych literature shows that heuristics or biases lead to incorrect beliefs, which in turn can lead to inaccurate stereotyping. And a great paper on stereotyping is Bordallo et al. In the QJE, where they have this model of stereotype formation that's based on the representative heuristic. And it basically shows that people in this model will use a tiny difference, and it'll amplify otherwise kernel of truth differences and lead to incorrect stereotypes, inaccurate beliefs. Another reason you might have inaccurate beliefs is a lack of information. So this, you may unknowingly have, for example, a selected sample in your experience, and that leads you to form priors on productivity that you don't realize are actually wrong. So what this does, the introduction of this otherwise, I would say, simple story, which is, are you actually right about your beliefs or priors, makes it extremely challenging to separate belief-based stories from taste-based stories. So let me get around that first by talking about what predictions do we do under the assumption of accurate? Well, assuming accurate beliefs with the statistical story, well, then you get some nice predictions. Changes in information asymmetry, however you can do that, lead to changes in differential treatment. So think of the intuition here as that if you tell me more and more about the Sarah and Johns of the world, the gender signal, if it's driven by information asymmetry and signal extraction, is less important to me. So examples of this is, suppose you provide more information about quality, then the gap should fall. Or on the supply side, if you ask for money from experienced VCs that presumably can read more into a pitch deck, the gap should fall as well. And the other key idea, this is where the outcome-based test comes in. Under accurate beliefs, if statistical discrimination is driving the differential treatment between men and women, then John performing better tells us that it's statistical, i.e. they're right, they're acting right, they're treating Sarah, differentially because they are correct that she underperforms. Now, what if they're incorrect? Well, if they're these incorrect beliefs, suppose instead that they actually have the same outcomes in expectation, so IPOs, follow-on rates. The question is, does this imply that we do not have statistical discrimination? Note, if I go back here, if John didn't perform better, we would likely, under accurate beliefs, assume taste. Well, unfortunately, as a researcher at least, this means that we cannot necessarily claim that taste is the driver. In particular, VCs could have inaccurate beliefs and engage in what's called inaccurate statistical discrimination. I'm going to talk a little bit more below in later slides about separating these explanations, but basically this is the big challenge. And in my paper with Rick in the JFE, we summarize this in pictures. I'm not going to go into too much depth. I encourage you to read at least this figure 1 in the paper. But the basic idea is with inaccurate beliefs, you get a situation where even though given investors have this perceived density of quality, in this case, let's say women, they believe the quality distribution is shifted to the left, and they use the same cutoff. They're being what they perceive as unbiased. They are going to, given the actual distribution is the same, they end up using a higher threshold for women. And it looks like when we use outcomes, for example, it looks like the taste-based story. Basically, the perceived quality generates, given the true distribution quality, a very similar outcome with taste. And so what the Bowen et al. Work shows is ways to generate variation, run experiments to try to tease out inaccurate statistical versus taste. Okay, I want to highlight that, of course, there are other explanations for the gender gap. If you find no gap, for example, in the funding of startups by gender or race, this doesn't mean we don't have problems. Choices made before entry into entrepreneurship or into raising capital could be a big reason why the gap goes away. So differences in human capital accumulation, preferences for career types, risk preferences, although I think new work is showing these risk preferences may not be that big of a deal, and then also self-selection due to anticipated frictions. We have to keep all of these in mind. I want to be clear that I suffered from this when I worked on this. Is part of these regressions, or can I make the gap go away by adding in controls? Not that I don't want to say there's discrimination, but it would be revealing if the null is actually, if the coefficient is actually 0. But what's important is by doing that, by making the gap between men and women go away by, say, controlling for education, is itself informative about the deeper reasons we have differential treatment. And so Small and Pager's 2020 JEP paper is an excellent, it's probably my second most highly rated paper I've read during this exercise of preparing, it's the sociological perspectives on discrimination. It's an excellent perspective, really changed my view on this whole setting. And I suggest you read it if you're interested in the area. But the key idea there, one of the key ideas, is the lack of differential treatment at one stage does not mean there's nothing to address. And I just want to keep that in mind. It's even more complicated if we let the psychologist in the room. Beyond the identification challenges that Bowen et al. Highlight, psychologists are making it more complicated. And I have some quotes here, but one important point is this body of work from psychology blurs the otherwise sharp line that economists like us tend to draw between taste and statistical. It's simply not as sharp of a line as we thought. And areas like evolutionary psychology and unconscious bias models make clear that limited information that drives statistical may in fact be endogenous or unconscious prejudice. And that leads us to sort of the final theory of discrimination. This is implicit discrimination. This is fairly cutting edge. The paper's a little bit older, but in terms of tests, I don't know of a lot of papers that are able to test this well outside of the lab. But what is implicit discrimination? This is sometimes when discrimination may be unintentional or outside the discriminator's awareness. There's a great paper with the title Implicit Discrimination cited here. And the idea here is lab tests show that humans suffer from unconscious beliefs that have real effects on behavior. It's one of the few things that's replicated in the lab these days. And common situations arise when this unconscious beliefs manifest in behavior. If you have high time pressure, high cognitive load, inattentiveness to task, and for the purposes of what I'm going to survey, things like cold email, bulk resume review are likely to have that situation, and ambiguous situations. What they talk about is how can we test for these things? When we see differential treatment, how much of it is implicit versus not? They suggest some tests, some of which are really hard to do. The big one is run an implicit association test on your subjects before the study. That requires a lot of planning, but if you can, I would suggest you do it. Alternatively, you can vary the situation. Going back a slide, think about all these sources of when unconscious bias shows up more. Well, what we should do is vary these things. And if the results change, it suggests that unconscious bias is going on. But overall, I think we have to temper our conclusions about taste versus statistical given this third way of thinking about the world. As I highlighted some of the papers, here's just my further highlighting implicit discrimination. That's a key paper. The inaccurate statistical discrimination is a cutting edge identification paper for anyone interested in the empirical side, and there's some more as well. Okay, let's review the literature. Maybe that's why you're all here, is to see some of the papers when you're writing your intro. Make sure you cite everybody. So this is a non-exhaustive list of papers both in econ and finance. I'm going to start with econ, and then I'm going to get to entrepreneurship. I've talked about this paper before, but it's a great way to think about how the econ literature is looking at the next decade, I think, of research, and particularly labor, education, and the like. So the good news or progress is that labor participation is increased across the world over time. Schooling is near parity, if not favoring women. Women are now, at least at the college level, more educated across the world. And pay and income gaps have shrunk. They are not gone, but they have declined. So in 2016, the average gap across OECD countries is now 13%. I think it used to be 30 back in the 80s. That's still bad, but it's better. And then income inequality, women, at least in Germany and the US, are playing a bigger role in the right tail of the income distribution, which is, again, good news, but it's still not 50%. So there's still gaps, but the trends are positive. And what this paper highlights is there's still some pain points. And I want to highlight these are exactly the same pain points that are showing up in the entrepreneurship literature as well. I already showed you the STEM choice. So basically educational choices are key. And then there's the motherhood penalty. And there's a nice quote: when the first time motherhood in the research results in dramatic consequences on mothers' earnings, but not fathers. And this is, this asymmetry is a key problem for the labor market, both entrepreneurship and otherwise. And so what this paper does is talk about, well, what's going on with these pain points, and basically highlighting things like different choices, what drives different choices. And again, I think this informs entrepreneurship literature as well. And a big part of the story is tied to sticky stereotypes and social norms. And the sociological literature makes, I think, a really important point, is that I think economists tend to think of norms as descriptive. Sociologists often think of norms as prescriptive. They tell people, or it's guide people's actions. And so it changes people's self-view and how they interpret other people's actions. And so this leads to conformity. And so we actually see this it's quite scary, actually, when people across the world are asked, when jobs are scarce, men have a right to the job more than women, and they're asked yes or no. This figure shows there is a surprising amount of shared beliefs across the world. Fortunately, the numbers are low in the US, but they're pretty close to the y=x line, 45-degree line. That's not great news. But overall, there's some shared beliefs about essentially gender roles across the world. And there's some really interesting causal evidence from a new work using Danish data that shows that first daughters, when they're born, when they're followed by second-born brothers, that results in lower future earnings and can predict occupational choice, which is consistent with a sort of upbringing in early childhood, leading to different choices of parents when it comes to gender conformity. And so this is one of the few pieces of causal evidence suggesting that these gender norms are playing an important role, and suggests there's further research needed. Golden's 2014 AER paper, I believe it is, the Grand Convergence, is another nice facts and where we should go next paper. And again, I think it informs the entrepreneurship literature. The three facts are: differences in earnings by sex greatly increased during the first several decades of working life. That's fact one. Fact two is within occupation, variation drives most of the gap on the average earnings that we see by gender. So think of this as within law, for example, the legal industry, the pay within that industry is driving most of the wage gap that we see overall. And then third, the gender pay gap depends on industry, and that variation itself rests on what they call workplace flexibility. And this figure on the right, I think, tells the story pretty well, is that some industries like business and law is not here, it's inside of business, have significantly larger gaps. This is female cross occupation than industries like tech and science, where workplace flexibility is quite different. We'll talk about that in a second. But these are basically just regression coefficients showing significant industry differences. And what this paper does is talk about formalizes the workplace flexibility and shows that if you have differences in industry and essentially in how much fixed time you have to put in to sort of get on the high wage scale, then you're going to have, of course, differences if women and men have different abilities or constraints in committing that amount of time input, or the lack of flexibility on interactions with your job. So it's a nice quote here, but basically, if in many workplaces, employees have to work with clients and accumulate knowledge and work with their team members over long periods of time, and that's rewarded with sort of convex pay scales, which, again, given this fact too, can help explain the overall gender gap. And so I think this workplace flexibility theme is important. In fact, we're seeing this in the entrepreneurship literature already. It's quite remarkable. Note the years here, 19 and 2020 papers. These three papers, I think, are closely tied to this workplace story, suggesting that entrepreneurship itself is being driven, at least in disparities, by this friction. So Core's 2020 paper shows that when maternity risk is high, women rationally select out of entrepreneurship because it requires a lot of time, even under risk neutrality. So this is an extension of the golden model. Jonathan's work, now forthcoming in the JFE, shows that reproductive health care, access to or lack of access, can predict entrepreneurship. And Josh, Rick, and Ting's paper shows that job protective leave and basically declining career risk can have predictive power for entrepreneurship. Overall, the entrepreneurship literature is sort of already in this game when it comes to understanding workplace flexibility. I think there's still more to do here. Okay, the literature also has, in terms of discrimination, sort of methods paper. I want to highlight a few, one I've already talked about. A really important one that doesn't get enough attention is David Newmark's 2012 paper. If you're going to run a correspondence study, and I admittedly did not know this paper when I ran my own. Fortunately, I accidentally did it right, I'll have to say. And suppose you run an audit or correspondence study. So I've done one of these. Heckman and Siegelman in 1993 highlight that under the statistical discrimination story, if the outcome of interest is based on a threshold rule, it's nonlinear basically. So I'm looking at workers applying for the job and I have a threshold and it's a yes or no decision. Then under that situation, a couple other assumptions, that if agents have different beliefs with different variances of unobserved productivity. So if men and women have different variances of unobserved productivity, and even though the averages are the same, this can result in differential treatment under this type of information asymmetry. And the basic idea is if you have a threshold rule, average productivity is the same, but variance is higher, then if the variance of women is higher, they're more likely to be, given this information asymmetry, above the threshold. So more likely to say yes to them in this constrained information environment. And so the Newmark paper makes clear the way to solve this is to make sure you include variation and observable measures of quality subject to some assumptions. So I just want to highlight this. Not enough people are doing it. And as a referee, it's me when I bring this up. So I've just revealed myself. Okay. The dynamics of discrimination I highlighted.
So Mike,
yeah.
I think for David Newmark's paper, it's mainly try to disentangle mechanisms. So previously, statistical discriminations, we test the first moment. And their idea is mainly that the second moment may also play a role here, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and also I think their paper assumes some monotonic hiring rules. So do you know any type of because I think in our setting maybe the hiring rule will be a little bit different. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. That little footnote at the bottom, subject to some assumptions. It's actually, he has a fairly aggressive parametric assumption that for solving it, Basically, the solution is adding in variation, observable quality. I haven't thought a lot about whether it's different in entrepreneurship, the threshold rule. I have to think about it a little bit more. I don't think it's that different, but I'm happy to talk afterwards about this in depth. I think this is a really interesting area. And this paper could be improved. You know, some econometricians could come in and try to find weaker assumptions to solve this problem in correspondence studies.
Thanks.
So I mentioned this paper earlier. This is I think, a precursor to the inaccurate statistical discrimination. We're going to talk about Song's video paper. He's a great example of actually trying to apply these types of things. But the key intuition from this paper is the dynamics of differential treatment, if you can observe it, can help reveal the source of taste-based versus inaccurate. Remember, that's a big identification problem under accurate versus inaccurate beliefs. And I've highlighted the quote here, but the basic idea is if discrimination is statistical, if we see things change, gaps shrink, for example, it reveals the beliefs versus preference-based stories. And similar to the Newmark story, they show that you can exploit the variance of quality signals, and adding in different types of signals can help you tease this out. And so my suggestion for entrepreneurship researchers, if you do these types of things, read this paper, but incorporate the methods in either your experiments, or if you're lucky, determine if your observational setting actually has some of this variation in it. And it's possible you might sort of have fallen into a natural experiment by mistake. Okay, so let's talk about gender and race patterns. The first is, I'm going to talk about is sort of how are men and women different in some behaviors. And I want to be clear here, this may be itself driven by social norms, gender norms, or past discrimination. One important fact is there has been documented the gender ask gap, that women tend to ask for lower salaries. An important question is whether these differences can explain the gender pay gap that still exists. And there's a great paper that uses hire.com. They have some really interesting information about basically bid and ask for salary on a job platform. And they show that controlling for the requested salary, the ask gap completely disappears. And what's really cool is they're able to exploit a change in the ask technology. What happened is they basically revealed what the median ask was, and this allowed agents, men and women, to make different decisions about their ask when they're asking for salary. And what they found is that once this ask technology was introduced, the ask gap disappeared and the bid gap also disappeared. So there's no differential treatment on salary offers. And so this paper generates some interesting questions. What the heck's going on? Women either didn't know what the median salary was and they systematically underestimated it, which is, an interesting thing we have to figure out, or they know the true distribution, but they're worried, some sort of risk story. And I think this generates ties directly to entrepreneurship, because a lot of what startup founders are doing are asking for things from investors or new employees. So understanding the sources of these differences is important. There's also some questions about how gender relates to language and gender relates to networking. These are two important papers in the area. Again, I'm not doing justice to some of these papers in terms of space constraints, but on the gender side, this is an interesting paper using grant applications that shows there's consistent gender differences in scientific communication. And given many startups are in the science and high tech area, this I think is important for example pitches. The text has different impacts depending on the setting. And so they exploit differences between the Gates Foundation and the NIH, I think it is. And they show that basically the NIH has very different constraints when it comes to applying. And this can lead, given there are differences in genderized language, this can lead to differences in grant outcomes. And the nice thing about this paper is they have a viable strategy, which is try to de-gender the application process. And I think this can inform things like startup pitches, competitions, and the like. Speaking of, there's a nice segue, startup pitches, the paper by Ramana and Sabrina uses randomized assignment to VC judges in the HPS pitch competition to explore the role of networking frictions in venture capital and the role of gender more broadly. And again, I'm not doing justice to this paper, but the idea is that more VCs are randomly assigned to you on average in a pitch competition, you're more likely to raise VC after. But basically when you split it by women, I've taken the screenshot here, this doesn't hold for women. And what they reveal is that this difference seems to be driven by the fact that women are less likely to proactively reach out to the VCs. They got a great survey, which I think we all have to try to fit in when we start trying to be able to answer it with our own observational data. Surveys are a great way to at least hint at the results, what's going on. And why they're doing this or not doing this, they could be anticipating discrimination, they might have beliefs about social norms, or it could be their own form of homophily. And again, these are great facts, but also leading to unanswered questions that folks like you in the room could potentially answer. Another important fact about gender, and I think it relates to entrepreneurship, is unequal punishment by bosses. This is Egan et al.'s work on financial advisors. What they're able to do with this really cool data is track misconduct by financial advisors, job turnover, penalties, and mobility. It's remarkable how much data they have. And they show that basically women are punished more. That's the result on the right, even though what they're doing is a lot less bad, essentially. So women they're conditioning on misconduct, but the misconduct is relatively better than what men are doing, but their bosses are punishing them. And they're able to use variation. This is important for the entrepreneurship literature, the variation in the gender of bosses to tease out explanations. And I think that's an underappreciated source of variation for this research area. And what they're able to do with that and some other sort of time variation is show that the most likely explanation is preference-based. That is, men just prefer men, and they're using a lower threshold for female advisors when punishing them. And so this is another example. I think this paper is a nice example of using clever use of variation in data against accidental variation to tease out explanations. Okay, let's talk about race, gender, and now entrepreneurship finally. I think the econ literature always should inform either finance and entrepreneurship, so that's why I started there. So first off, there's a great paper by Rob and Alicia that looks at Black-owned business performance. And they find these two important facts. I already highlighted one. There's a difference in performance on the left side here, is that conditional on founding a firm, African-American owned firms are smaller, lower profits, they grow less rapidly, they're less likely to survive. And what they show, they have enormous amount of data, so they're able to test out a lot of things, sort of kitchen sink this. And they show, and I'm going to quote them, the lack of prior work experience in a family business among Black business owners, perhaps limiting their acquisition of human capital, negatively affects Black business outcomes. And this, was great because it actually suggests policy implications. And it also, they're able to rule out a whole host of other explanations with the powerful data that they have. And so this, another example of pipeline, right? So we see this in gender as well. The role of female VCs, if they can attenuate some of the discrimination, could lead to a pipeline of future female VCs, and that experience may benefit the long-run distribution of gender in the field. And I think the same could go here. The small business credit market is, of course, very important for companies. And so Blanchflower's 03, I think is a Restat paper, has a nice fact that unfortunate fact, that Black small business owners are twice as likely to be denied credit than otherwise identical white applicants. And again, they have amazing data. So the otherwise identical is pretty close to true. And this is a nice way to do this. It looks a little bit like a blinder decomposition, where they basically try to explain away, so to speak, the coefficient on the minority, the dummy variable, and they just basically can't make it go away. This is a logit, so you could treat this as not one as bad. The results, again, this is a kitchen sink approach. They have credit ratings and wealth. So they basically show that throwing the kitchen sink does not remove the result, and they conclude that this is most consistent with a form of statistical discrimination or taste-based discrimination. There's also, of course, a literature now on the entrepreneurship side of gender gaps. And I'm going to go into the gender gap in VC and small business. This work uses a great data set, a good example of if I can have the population of firms, I can answer a lot of questions, even though I don't have randomization. So their question is using the population of California and Massachusetts-based new firms, of which they're able to, and this is the key, they're able to actually create the risk set of high growth and innovative firms, those that are, the Sarah of the Johns of the world that we think are raising their hands for VC. They're able to explore the gender gap in funded startups. And a key result for me in their paper is the funnel, is they show that 22% of startups are female founded, at least one woman, but once we condition on outcomes and then funding, this funnel gets a lot smaller. So I think it's 10% actually get venture capital, and only 7% have an IPO. And my view of this paper, this is not a critique, is it's a kitchen sink solution to a lot of the problems with careful attention to theory. So throwing in controls, the coefficient falls, and they conclude that 65% of the observed differential access and funding is due to sorting. And I like this attention to sorting. This is not the idea that women are inheriting certain things. It's just that they're sorting ex ante into, for example, industry or certain features of startups that drive lower funding rates. We can also look at how individuals pitch and how investors respond, particularly by gender. And there's two representative papers here. There's a set of experiments using pitches to investors and from Brooks et al., where they show basically investors prefer men. And there's this weird angle on attractiveness I'm not going to get into. But these 3 experiments show that investors prefer pitches presented by male entrepreneurs when compared to females. So basically, they're pitching the same thing. The only thing that changes is the gender of the individual. The results are quite striking, and it holds across these 3 settings, which is pretty reassuring. And a similar, sort of question about the role of investors responding to gender. Will and Ilya have a great paper using a field experiment or a correspondence study where they sent out a ridiculous amount of emails. Here's an example of one. And this is a huge technological hurdle to overcome, and I commend them for being able to solve this. What they're able to do is vary basically name. They also varied race, Asian versus white. And they're able to show that unlike a lot of other studies, there's evidence of bias for women in the results down here. It's small but significant. They're able to see this because of the power in their sample size. They basically show there's about a 4% difference in interest. And an open question of what's going on here. I think there's unanswered questions for the field and for this paper about what's going on, but it's intriguing and worthy of future study. Okay, so an important question about stereotypes is if and how investors themselves are responding to them. Assuming sorting into the, let's say, industry, how important is this in explaining outcomes? And so in Camille's work, her job market paper, she explores this in French data using, again, I think essentially a population of all firms. And she asks, what role do gender stereotypes play in exploring funding differences by gender? And the key variable here, this is, solution without experiment is really, do I have the data, either breadth or depth? This paper has both. She's able to use a 4-digit SIC category, look at gender composition and separate out sectors by female dominated versus male dominated. And the basic prediction is if gender norms are playing a role in differential treatment and stereotypes matter, then we should see differences in behavior by gender within those 2 female versus male dominated sectors. And indeed, that's what she finds. And she finds that women in female dominated sectors are preferred and vice versa for men, both more so in venture than in debt. And using outcomes, and this is the key, using outcomes, she's able to make a conclusion that what seems to be driving this is average miscalibrated beliefs, which is another version of inaccurate beliefs about gender and types. And using outcomes like employees, and I think even IPOs is not taking the snapshot here. But the key idea is outcome-based tests can help us learn with some assumptions, the separation between taste and statistical. If I'm going to skip anything, I should skip my own paper in the interest of time, but I can quickly go over 3 papers on angels and VCs. The basic conclusions of these, my work with Rick, shows that women raising capital on angel list, and the key to me, the innovation of our paper, if there is one, is that we're able, much like this paper and this paper, which has a population of startups, this is a population of startups, we were able to explore the population of startups on angel lists that sought capital, funded and unfunded. The power of that is I think, underappreciated in many areas. Knowing the risk set is crucial, even without randomization. So in our paper, we find is with that risk set, women are less likely to garner interest from male investors. And the other innovation in the paper is we can see the population of investors and their gender. And so this variation in investor gender allows us to separate out explanations in a way that are otherwise unavailable. So we can see, for example, men prefer men, women prefer women. And that combined with our outcome test, which is highlighted at the bottom, allows us to conclude it looks like men are showing some form of taste or miscalibrated beliefs. And I could blame the papers that introduced this inaccurate beliefs. We can't separate the two. We just don't have the variation, but I think it's an interesting area. 2 other papers highlighted here on the right explore the role of gender on the supply side. And the basic conclusions from the first one, the Rainet 2019 paper shows that female entrepreneurs underperform, but they do better when they're invested in by women. And this performance gap declines. And this is a really important result about understanding cross-sectional differences, because if VCs are responding to this dummy variable, for example, rationally investing in women. Suppose statistical discrimination is driven by this negative 0.326. Well, we have to understand what that's driven by, and perhaps it's that women don't have enough female VCs to invest in them. And then Paul Gompers and co-authors have some nice work looking at the performance attribution within VC firms. And they show that female VCs underperform their male peers, but this is driven by a lack of sensitivity to the performance of their male peers. It's a really striking result. Basic idea is I don't get benefit from being at Sequoia if I'm a woman. I only benefit from being at Sequoia if I'm a man. I'm simplifying it, but that to me is the story. And then I think last is Song's paper. He was nice enough to provide his slides, so I've got some pretty pictures. He's got this great work looking at real video pitches and using machine learning, extracting what I think calls it the pitch factor. Pitch factor predicts investing, but it predicts underperformance. So conditional on funding, these positive teams underperform. That's the first thing. Song, hopefully I'm doing justice to your paper. What's really cool is Song, I think at the top here, is able to build out this framework. The reason that human interactions might matter, whether it's bias or not, he's got the data combined with an experiment I'll talk about in a second to separate out inaccurate versus taste-based. So he shows basically women are treated differently with respect to this pitch factor than men. And the question is this a bias or a non-biased story? And as usual, we can use outcomes to tease this out. We already know that the performance is worse when you have a positive pitch factor. But Song takes it the step that I think for researchers who want to get things done quickly, I'll say unfortunately, he added an experiment to help tease this out, which is following what I think the literature suggested. And using pitches on, I think it's Yale MBA students, he can elicit beliefs and confidence in beliefs, and then employ this dynamic discrimination framework and disentangle the role of inaccurate versus taste. My view is this is a sort of cutting edge of applying these methods in finance, and I encourage you to read it because I'm just not doing justice to it right now. Okay, I've got a few minutes. Sorry if you have to go, I understand. It'll be recorded in slides. I knew it would take a little bit longer, but whatever. Let's talk about the methods quickly. These are important. I think first off, you probably see these papers. I'm just gonna put it quickly here. Assigning race and gender, there are known methods for doing it. If you have pictures, there are approaches. If it's race, last name plus census data. If it's gender, first name combined with one of these methods. I would encourage you, it is relatively cheap to outsource now. If there is any ambiguity in names, use humans to ascertain whether it's a woman or a man or black versus white. The key idea here is measurement error is of course not your friend when it comes to these coefficients and regressions, right? It's only gonna make everything go to zero. So we have to reduce measurement error to almost the extreme. I highlighted this earlier. I think the bar is pretty high for testing discrimination, and in turn, the bar is going to be high for data. I think the ideal data outside of the lab is going to be a risk set of individuals that want to be entrepreneurs. Conditioning on funding is useful, but can really limit what types of answers you can form. And I think this has been nearly attained in the papers highlighted here or any census data. This, of course, usually comes at the cost of firm or person observables, and it's really the only data, I think, if you want to quantify the gap, right? The gap in entrepreneurial activity needs a risk set that's really wide. And again, smaller conditional data sets like funding allow us to better understand mechanisms or precursors, but they are quite limited, and I think you have to be careful there. If you're going to do a field experiment, here are the warning signs. I'm just going to leave this here quickly. Get IRB approval. They're annoying, but they're trying to protect human subjects, so please do that. I'm on one, so I take this seriously. Remember the Newmark critique as well. Here's some recommended variables and variation. I think you need outcomes. I would not start a discrimination paper if I was a PhD student, if I did not have clear, well-known outcome variables, because they're a requirement to separating out these tests. And as I've shown you, they're not enough, unfortunately, but they are at least a starting point. You need, I think, gender or race variation on what I call the evaluators. If this is available, it really helps fill in the gaps, no pun intended, on the variation that may be missing in outcomes. Understanding male and female bosses or male and female investors is really important. You can make multiple assumptions about preferences and taste and help tease out these explanations. And if available, an objective signal of quality goes a long way. Pitch competitions with rankings or credit scores. Some more recommended variables and variation. I think really important one if you can do it, there's a site here, is variation and opaqueness of signals. Basically, varying information asymmetry is actually at the heart of some of the dynamic discrimination stories. Basically, reducing noise and increasing noise helps tease out stories. So when you're building your paper, your experiment, or building data, keep this stuff in mind, because it could, you could hit a real wall when it comes to publishing if you don't have this variation at the end. I want to keep in mind as well, readers and audience members often seek to rationalize differential treatment. It is remarkable. When I presented the paper with Rick, people just constantly want to say, oh yeah, it's negative, but it's just this. The kitchen sink is your friend to shutting those people up, but I think we have to be careful, again, when results go away because of controls, that tells us something. And the Neal and Johnson paper on black versus white in labor markets is kind of one of those things where the results go away, but the reason they go away is the result of the paper. It tells us the precursors, and there's a nice quote here. We have a problem where if we make the results go away with controls, it tells us there must be sorting because of discrimination itself. Finally, variation, like eliciting beliefs of evaluators. If you can do it, run little experiments, or if you can, run the implicit association test. That's hard, but I would do it. And I think this is my last slide. The next steps for the literature. I think the topics, there's lots of evidence for the gap. I don't know how much more we need there. I mean, I encourage, robust results are great, but we have much less evidence on where it's arising, the pipeline. Things like pre-founding decisions, education, career. We've got some new great work on maternity, for example. But the role of democratization is really key here. This is variation that basically downplays information, for example. Crowdfunding and Jobs Act should diminish things. And there's some evidence in the literature suggesting this isn't declining the gap that does exist. And I think this is an open question of what's going on here. What does it tell us about taste versus statistical? And Camille's work on social norms and stereotypes is, I think, opens up a whole area about stepping one step back, I should say, and thinking about where these are coming from. And the methods are important as well. I think the complexity now of this discrimination theory, which I hope I've made clear, means that you might need to add a lab or field experiment as a sort of supplement to your paper. At the very least, richer biographical data about entrepreneurs to see things like pre-education decisions, and seeking out natural experiments. This has not been done enough. I think once you have a deeper understanding, my slides do not do it justice, but if you get a deeper understanding of the theory, what are the identification problems? I think you'll have a new view on the natural experiments. What's the variation out in the world that could give us naturally some of this variation to tease this out? I have not seen people do this yet, particularly in this entrepreneurship. And I think there's some really promising areas there. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's, we're not going to be able to run the lab experiments forever. We have to use the real world. So that's it. Thank you. I'm going to post some more information on the lecture. Only went 4 over. Next lecture, which is in a little over a month, Arthur is going to present the risk and return of private equity. He already has a survey paper on this. So I suspect if you take a look at that, you'll learn a lot about what he's going to talk about, and he's going to do more than that. But I encourage you to attend that. Thanks for your time. I'll be here for the next 15 to 20 minutes. I hope you learned something. Maybe some new questions arose in your own research. Let me know. I'll be available by email as well. So thanks again.